Good afternoon. My name is Neel Kashkari. I'm president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. On behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank, on behalf of my partner, Justice Allan Page, thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate this great interest. We had such interest that we had to close the room because we had so many people who had signed up, and so we had a long waiting list, and we're live streaming this. So I hope that the folks who couldn't get in here physically are watching at home, and we're recording all of this, so it'll all be available on the Minneapolis Fed's website for anybody who would like to see afterwards. First of all, thank you all for being here in person. We really appreciate it. I want to recognize a number of people. We have some wonderful folks with us today. Later on, our keynote speaker, Attorney General Keith Ellison, will be joining us. We're grateful for the Attorney General. We have several leaders of our tribal nations who are here today. Thank you for being here. Several state legislators, both sides of the aisle. Thank you for being here. Some directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, some school superintendents and teachers. Just a lot of interested people around the state who care about closing the achievement gap. And so thank all of you for being here. And all of our speakers on our panels, thank you for being here as well. Really important to have your voices as part of this deliberation and hearing your ideas and your expertise. What's going to happen today is I'm here welcoming you. And then I'm going to call on one of my colleagues, Anusha Nath, who I'll introduce in a second, to go over the research. At the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, we pride ourselves in our research. We want to advocate ideas that are grounded in data and analysis. And Anusha is going to show you some of our most recent research as it relates to achievement gaps in Minnesota and what we can do about it. Then Justice Page and our wonderful host, Angela Davis, will come up here and have a conversation about our proposed amendment, why we designed it the way we did, what we hope it achieves. Thank you, Angela, for being here with us. We're going to have two community panels, a policymaker panel, and then a educator and community leader panel. Again, looking forward to hearing these diverse perspectives. And then we're going to welcome the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, to offer his remarks. And then Justice Page and I will join Attorney General Ellison for a conversation. And then I will wrap up, and we'll be having a reception here, which I hope you all can stay for. Housekeeping items, I mentioned that it's live streamed. We have a lot to pack in, so we don't have any formal breaks. But if you need to get up to use the men's room or ladies' room, it's right across the hall. Please do that. There should be information on how to access Wi-Fi in your materials. There's so many people in the room, it's going to be hard for us to send mics around for questions, so we're going to be using a technology called Pigeonhole to collect questions you can submit either via a card or via your smartphone. People watching online will be able to submit the questions as well. There should be instructions here. You go to pigeonhole.at, and then there's a passcode that'll ask you children first, children 1ST. You can get into the system. You'll be able to submit your questions. You'll be able to see questions that other people have submitted, and then the moderators will ask those questions of the panelists at the time. So for each, both for Justice Page and myself, and then for the two panels that follow, you will have opportunities to submit your questions. So please do so. And again, in your materials, it should repeat the same information. So with that, I want to go ahead and kick off with our research presentation. Dr. Anusha Nath has been a research economist at the Minneapolis Fed since 2016. Her research is focused on applied economics, development economics, and the political economy. Anusha and Rob have been, her partner, Rob Grunewald, have been very involved in doing this research to give us the data and analysis to make our best decisions. Just a reminder, the Minneapolis Fed for 15 or 20 years has been a pioneer in work around early childhood education and the economic implications of early childhood education. We're really proud of that work. We think that that work has made a difference in people's lives in Minnesota. And let me just say, people have asked me, why does the Federal Reserve care about education? My role as a monetary policymaker, Congress, the United States Congress has given the Federal Reserve, we call our dual mandate, two goals. One goal is stable prices, thinking of an economy that's not overheating, but also not limping along, and maximum employment. As many Americans as possible participating in the job market. There is no better determinant of your success in the job market than the education that you received. So for us to achieve maximum employment, education is at its foundation. And we're really proud of the work that this bank has done on early childhood education. And we believe that this work that we're doing today builds on that success and can hopefully take it forward. So with that, please join me in welcoming Anusha Nath.
Thank you, President Kashkari, for the introduction. This is joint work with Rob Grunewald and Scott Dahlman. The presentation outline is as follows. First, I'll talk a little bit about education gaps in Minnesota. Many of you are aware of these gaps that exist, but what we've done in our report is looked at what are the nature of these gaps and what is the extent of these gaps across Minnesota. And today I will show some patterns across groups and time that we've observed in our analysis. The second part of the presentation will focus on education clauses in state constitutions. So Scott Dahlman and I have collected all amendments that have been proposed since 1990, and we verified them. And what I'll present to you are some patterns that we observe in these proposed amendments across states. And then we'll give an illustration, a case study, which will illustrate that constitutional amendments can be drivers of policy change. So let me begin with the achievement gap patterns. So the first fact that we observe, and that many of you might know, is that there's a large and persistent gap in test scores across time. So what we've plotted here are average grade 4 reading scores from the NAEP exam, and we've looked at, here what we are just showing are these average scores across different racial groups. As we can see, the average scores are the highest for the white students, and there's a huge gap across all the other races, whether you look at Hispanic, African American, or American Indian students. Second fact is that although test scores have been persistent, there's been some improvement in high school graduation rates. So again, the whites do much better. And there has been improvement and catching up of other races in terms of graduation rates over time. This pattern is similar when you look at socioeconomic status as well. But even though graduation rates have been improving and the gaps have been reducing over time, what we find is college readiness indicators show us that the gaps across racial groups or socioeconomic groups in college readiness still are very high and very persistent over time. So we haven't really made much progress on that measure. Achievement levels vary across the state. This map depicts all the school districts across the state. As you can see, what we have here is the darker shaded school districts are the ones which have higher reading scores on MCA 3 reading scores, and the lower shaded or lighter shaded school districts are the ones that perform the worst. And so you can see that all over the state, whether it's urban or rural, there's some states which do really well and some states which do not as well. And when you look at the rural-urban gaps on an average, we really see no difference. And you can see the dispersion in pattern here. Again, if you look at any other measure, we see a similar pattern, and it correlates with socioeconomic status as well. So school districts which are poorer or have a higher minority share of students who are minority typically tend to do worse. So disparities do span all of the state. These are outcomes. What about inputs? Minnesota has actually done really well in trying to reduce some disparities or inequities in inputs across schools and school districts across the state. In particular, what we find in our report is that when you compare the schools which have either a higher minority population or a higher student population which has a free and reduced price lunch eligibility, which is sort of proxy for socioeconomic status, you find that those schools typically do tend to have higher per pupil expenditure on instruction. So this means Minnesota has done well in trying to reduce those gaps across time. They also have similar class sizes compared to the average. But what we find in our report is that teachers who are in these high minority schools or schools which have a high proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch tend to have lower years of experience. Right? So those are some of the patterns we observe in inputs. Just to summarize, although Minnesota has done well to reduce inequality in some of the inputs, we still have large persistent disparities in outcomes, however you measure it, however you look at the disparity, whether across group, across time, or across space. So what can Minnesota do? There have been other states who've had faced similar problems, and one of the methods one of the things that states have done is to look at the framework, policy framework within which they choose policies and shifted their focus towards things or sort of policies which are important or are needs of the children of their time. So one of the things they've done is to look at constitutions and see whether they can amend the clauses to better provide for high quality education for their children. So what I'll do now is just go over some of the variation in education clauses across states and then talk about a case study. So the US Constitution is silent on the subject of education, but every state has an education clause. And there's a large variation in what type of language is adopted or what type of provisions are in these education clauses. Some states only stipulate that state provide public education, for example, free or public education, or they stipulate that there should be a common system of schools. But other states go beyond that and require that some high-quality public education should be provided for. So just to give an idea of what these provisions might look like, these are some provisions we've taken from other state education clauses. Most of these they go beyond just a provision of free education or a public education or a common system of education. The ones on the top, the ones at the bottom would be somewhat higher mandates for the states. So let me just quickly go through these. The first provision that I would like you to focus on is the uniform system. About 15 states have that, including Minnesota. Thorough and efficient is a provision that's also in many state education clauses, including Minnesota. Equal rights, which includes the fundamental right, or education be of fundamental value, as in Florida, is included in some states as well, Illinois, Michigan, and so on. There are 2 states which require that the duty of the state to provide for education be either of paramount or of primary importance, and those are Florida and Washington. And there are 3 states which require that the state should provide high-quality education. And out of that, Virginia and Oregon are 2 states where Oregon actually doesn't provide for a high-quality education, but it does require that the legislature define what quality standards should look like in the Constitution Education Clause itself. So as you can see, there's variation in how states define either the duty of the states or the rights of their children. Now, all states, the language that they have in their constitutions, including education clause, does not stay constant over time. It changes, and all states include an option to amend. There are 3 main ways to initiate an amendment. Okay? The first is a legislative referral, which all states allow for, which means the legislature can draft a bill. Once it gets passed, then it gets put on the ballot for citizens to vote upon. A direct initiative is a second option, which 18 states allow for, which means that the citizens themselves can collect signatures, and if they get X amount of signatures, then it gets put on the ballot. The third way is an independent commission, which only Florida allows for today. And this is where an independent commission is set up every 20 years to give recommendations directly to citizens about what constitutional amendments could be taken up, and the citizens directly vote on those recommendations. And Minnesota only allows for the first option. So here's a map of the amendments that have taken place in the last 30 years. So Scott and I, we collected these and verified these amendments between 1990 and 2018. There were 312 such amendments across states, and out of which 193 passed. And these amendments, they span various issues. They had issues such as fundamental rights, which I'll talk about in a minute. Some of them required states to provide high-quality education, which again I talked about a little bit. But they also had issues such as raising the debt limit or providing more revenue or school choice and so on. So every state has different issues that it has adopted based on the needs of their children. So just to quickly summarize, many states have amended their education clauses. In the last 30 years, there have been 312 such proposed amendments, span a variety of issues. But as we see in this map, Minnesota actually does not have any amendments. This is 1990, but in fact, Minnesota has no proposed amendments to its education clause since 1857, when it was first written. So why should we care about amendments? So we'll now present a case study, which is purely to illustrate that when you have constitution amendments, it can lead to policy changes, right? So let me take the example of Florida's 1998 amendment. This, as I mentioned, Florida is the only state which has an independent constitutional review committee. And in 1998, it was formed. And the committee went around and asked citizens for their feedback about recommendations. And one of the things they found was education was very salient. And Florida at that time also struggled with its disparities and achievement outcomes. So the commission recommended an amendment to the education clause, and the recommendation was directly put on the ballot. And the citizens voted for it, and it got 75% of the votes on the ballot. It strengthened Florida's education clause in the following way. So the part that is struck is what was removed by the amendment. The lines that were added were the amendment's recommendation of adding it to the then existing education clause. And part to note that how it strengthened the education clause was by including language or provisions, including fundamental value of the people, that education of children is a fundamental value, that the duty of the state to make adequate provisions is a paramount duty. It also included provisions for high quality education as well. So what did this do? That was 1998. In June 1999, there were a comprehensive set of policies that were adopted in order to execute some of the provisions that were included in the new amended clause. And examples of such policies were, in order to, by recognizing that it's now a paramount duty of the state to provide education, and that the education should be of high quality, one of the acts that was introduced was the School Readiness Act. So the legislature recognized that students can't get high quality education if they're not ready to learn. So they prepared and they provided for early childhood education. They also recognized that given the existing system, if schools are failing, in order to provide the students with high quality education, they provided scholarship for students to be able to go to other well-functioning or better performing public schools and private schools as well. And also, they realized, well, one of the things that is important for students to learn is consistent attendance. And they realized, especially students from minority households or lower socioeconomic background, have a hard time attending schools due to other factors in their household, including instability in their house or communities. So what it did, it required schools to monitor attendance of students and require that the schools reach out to the families and make sure that the students are able to attend school and mitigate any other circumstances that might be affecting their attendance. Other provisions that they included in order to make sure that there is a provision of high quality is teacher development. So they had a huge comprehensive set of tools that they developed for in-service professional development for students who are already, teachers who are already teaching, but also for incoming teachers. They increased accountability standards for post-secondary education programs that prepare future educators. In addition to these legislative policies that came about in 1999, there were two further amendments to the Constitution. In 2002, this was citizen-directed or citizen-initiated amendments. The first was the class size amendment. Again, in order to make sure that quality of education is high, they restricted the number of students that would be in a classroom. And this amendment required the legislature to provide the funding in order to do so. And it passed with 52.4% of the votes on the ballot. And the second amendment in 2002 was the free voluntary universal pre-K, which was available for every 4-year-old child in Florida if they wanted to attend such a program. And it required that these programs be of high quality. So this was a 2002 amendment per se. And it passed with 59.2% of the votes. Now, did it do anything? Well, overall, we know that there was a very comprehensive set of changes that occurred after the 1998 amendment. And what we see since is that outcomes have improved in Florida, so the needle has moved. For example, if you look at the grade 4 reading scores, which I've been showing you in the past, we find that in 2003, in the national rankings of these average test scores, Florida was ranked 33rd, and it ranks 6th today. And in terms of socioeconomic status and disparities, whether they've gone down, Especially in grade 4 reading scores, we find that Florida had a 30th lowest gap, and today it has a 6th lower gap. In fact, when you look at racial disparities, today Florida is number 1 in having the smallest gap in the white-Hispanic disparity. In fact, the students who are Hispanic are learning at par with students who are white. The white-black scores are not as impressive as white-Hispanic or some of the socioeconomic gaps reductions, but it still has moved the needle quite a bit. So just to summarize, this example of Florida illustrates that there was an amendment which strengthened the education clause, and it led to a comprehensive set of policies, right, which seems to have, on a whole, moved the needle for students of Florida. There are other case studies. I remember there are 312 amendments in the last 30 years. We've looked at a couple of other case studies which tell a similar story. So the main takeaway from today's presentation is the following. Our research finds that Minnesota currently has one of the largest achievement gaps across race and socioeconomic status in the nation, and these gaps have persisted over time. Minnesota can learn from other states, especially states who have tried to reevaluate the framework within which the policies are chosen and how they've used the education clauses of the Constitution to refocus on the core issues that they think are important for their children. And what worked in Florida or Louisiana or any other state may not work for Minnesota, but hopefully the case studies have convinced you that constitutional amendments can be a driver of change. And with that note, I would like to call upon Angela Davis, who will be talking about why an amendment in Minnesota.
And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm Angela Davis from Minnesota Public Radio. I love a good conversation, and I love bold new ideas. That's why I'm so honored to be here today with you today to talk about this idea, this proposal to address Minnesota's achievement gap. I have a lot of questions about how this proposal would work, why there is such a strong belief that it would make a significant difference in the lives of students across our state. And I also want to know, is it feasible? So I want to introduce the two people who say they have answers to all of these questions and that they have some evidence to back it up. Let me introduce our panelists, and I know that you all already know them well, but we have Neel Kashkari here, who is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He is a former aerospace engineer who later served in several senior positions at the U.S. Treasury Department. And you may know that also in 2014, he ran for governor of California on a platform of economic opportunity. Next to him is Allan Page. He is the co-founder of the Page Education Foundation, a former Minnesota Supreme Court justice and a former Minnesota Viking. He has been working on educational issues for decades. I won't say how many decades because it might reveal his age. And we all know he has a deep personal investment in this issue. And so I'm going to sit down and ask you all a couple of questions. And first of all, I know this issue is important to you, but it seems like the persistent achievement gap here in Minnesota is more than a problem that you find interesting. You seem genuinely disturbed by it. And so, President Kashkari, tell me, why is this so personal for you?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here, Angela. My parents came to America 55 or so years ago from India. I was born in Akron, Ohio. Justice Page was born in Canton, Ohio. That's like Minneapolis, St. Paul. What are the odds of that? We were a very unremarkable immigrant family, very typical. But my parents insisted that my sister and me get a good education. And because I was able to get a good education, every door of this country has been open to me. So here I am, typical kid, son of immigrants, unremarkable, and I get to go and become the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, only possible because I got a good education. So for me, the fact that that's not available to every child in America is a national tragedy. And if we can start in Minnesota and make sure every child in Minnesota gets a good education, then we can tackle the other 49 states later.
Justice Page?
Well, for me, it began, I suppose, growing up in Canton, Ohio, 1954, when the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education. For those of you who were around then, schools were segregated, by law. And the court changed that. And it gave me the sense of the power, both of the law, but of the power of education. I also had parents who knew and understood its importance and reinforced that in me and made sure that I understood it. Education, it seems to me, is, you talk about great equalizers. This is one tool that will help any child achieve whatever their hopes and dreams are. It is one tool that will allow every child to be put into the position to choose what their future will hold, as opposed to having a criminal justice system that chooses that future for them. If you simply look at incarceration rates and educational performance, it is enough to say we need to do something. And so for me, it's about justice.
So when I heard the announcement that a bold new proposal was coming, I was like, okay, I'm ready, let's do this. I'm tired of talking about the achievement gap. Let's see some action. A constitutional amendment, it was puzzling to me. And so President Kashkari, explain why you believe that a constitutional amendment, that is the best choice now to bring about meaningful change to children here in Minnesota.
We got to this recommendation after with Anusha and our researchers studying what's been done in Minnesota. There have been many policy changes that have been tried over the last several decades, and if you look at the data, nothing has moved the needle. We've literally made no progress in closing the achievement gap. And what I found is, and I reached out to Justice Page about a year ago and said, how do we literally put children first? Everybody we meet with says, I'm for children first. But then what we found is, one party has their proposed solutions, their preferred solutions. Another party has their preferred solutions. And what they're really saying is, I'm for children first as long as it's my solution. What Justice Page and I figured out, maybe he figured it out long before me, but what we've put together is, let's literally put children first and outcomes for children first in the eyes of the law. And then let's allow all the solutions that can actually deliver those outcomes to be available. And that's why I think it fundamentally changes the paradigm.
Justice Page, we haven't seen much progress. Why do you believe that a
Much progress?
We have not seen much progress.
We seem to be going the wrong direction. We seem to be going backwards instead of forward. So I'm not sure about much progress.
No progress.
No
Negative progress.
Negative progress.
We're sliding.
And you had a question.
Why the constitutional amendment? How is it different? Why is this the way?
Well, it is no accident that our proposal begins with the words, all children. Talk about putting children first. This puts children first. It also makes the education of children a paramount duty of the state through public schools, so that you give children a fundamental right to an education that requires, through an amendment that requires that they be prepared to participate fully in our economy, our democracy, and our society. You create standards, and those will be created by parents and everybody else along the way. And just, those standards are a hot button issue. If we didn't have standards, how would we know we had this gap? And how would we begin to fix the unfairness that children face if we didn't have standards?
Well, I look at this room, there are a lot of educators in the room, and I'm curious about, how would a constitutional amendment, what would it do? How would it change the day-to-day activities at a school or in a classroom?
Well, first of all, it's going to I think, move the needle to get the legislature and the rest of state government moving towards putting in place policies and procedures that work. I mean, we know what works in schools. For whatever reason, we come at it from a million different directions, and everybody's trying to do the right thing, but none of it seems to come together. This will, I think, be a catalyst for breaking some of the log jams that we face. The other thing is, I should note that the current Constitution focuses on the system and inputs to that system. This shifts the focus a bit to children and outcomes. And so on a day-to-day basis, that is to be seen. But it's going to empower and give voice to children and their parents who are not having their right fulfilled, to go to the legislature, go to the governor, and go to the courts and say, I'm being denied my civil right.
This is literally creating a civil right in the best tradition of this country. And you think about when civil rights have been created or expanded, the right to vote. It doesn't lead to necessarily transformation overnight, but it leads to structural change that fundamentally transforms society. So Justice Page and I challenged each other. We said, what could we do so that we're not having the same conversation 20 years from now? This is the most powerful idea we've been able to come up with. But as he said, we can't tell you, what is the system going to look like 20 years from now? I don't know. Justice Page doesn't know. But we do know that children will be first, and the entire state, the paramount duty of the state, will be ensuring that every child in Minnesota gets a quality education. That's transformation that gets me excited.
Through public schools.
Yes.
And I emphasize, through public schools.
You said something interesting. You said, we know what works in schools. You visit classrooms regularly. In your opinion, what works? What works in school? What do you see that is working, that needs to be spread?
I have the good fortune and the privilege to have a school named after me.
I know you do.
And
I'm happy about that, too.
I am too. And you will have the good fortune to hear from Aaron Rathke, the principal of that school. But I walk into the building and I see teachers who are not only concerned about children, but are working in everything they do at every stage of the day to ensure that children learn. They're welcoming, they're understanding, and it's not just to the children in the school, but to their parents and families. We talk about community, and they are organized around grade levels. Each grade level is a community, and that sense of being a part of and a contributor to, that I think lifts everybody. So that's one of the things that happens on a daily basis. I mean, you really need to spend some time in schools. I will say for the last 50 years, I've been in schools and classrooms across this country, talking to kindergartners, talking to and with kindergartners, and talking to and with high school seniors and everybody in between. And all of those children want to learn. They're curious, they're interested, they're exciting. They just need an environment and a place to go to that nourishes that and encourages it and allows it to come out.
President Kashkari, the proposal comes on the heels of new research by the Federal Reserve, and we just heard some of the findings in Anusha's presentation there. What stands out to you in those findings? What is most noteworthy there to you?
A couple things. One is that we've made no progress. I mean, the graduation gaps that Anusha showed closing, but if you look at that and then look at the college readiness gaps, We can graduate everybody tomorrow and just pretend that we don't have a problem. We're already doing that. And we cannot allow that to continue. And that's why Justice Page and I worked on making sure that there is accountability built into the Constitution till we make sure that students are in fact learning, because we don't want to take the easy way out, because we're not going to be doing anybody any favors if we do that. So that really jumped out at me, the lack of progress. But then when I hear education policymakers say, oh, but the graduation gaps are closing, that's the easy way out.
So my understanding of the process is that the state legislature would have to vote on this, approve the idea, agree to put it on the ballot of the next statewide election, allowing voters to decide if this is the way to go. That sounds like a lot of hurdles.
Well, life is full of hurdles. And you either figure out how to get over them, around them, or through them. And I like to think that we live in a state where everybody has an interest in putting children first. I mean, let's face it, from an economic standpoint, every lost child is a lost employee, a lost customer, and a diminished taxpayer. So why wouldn't we want to put children, that's just from the economic side, put aside the human cost. I believe that our legislature is prepared to do the right thing.
You got kind of quiet there.
Well, that's so that everybody listens a little more.
They linked in? Okay.
Exactly. Do we have challenges in front of us? Of course. But at least from my vantage point, if we don't do anything, then we can be here long after I'm gone having this same conversation.
President Kashkari, the hurdles you have to...
I'm new to Minnesota. I moved here 4 years ago. I was most taken aback when I discovered these disparities that are here. But I do think that Minnesotans care about each other. I do think Minnesotans care about their neighbors. It's not just their own kids, it's their neighbors' kids. I do think we have a real chance. I think if the legislature will support this and we can get this on the ballot, I believe that the people of Minnesota will put children first. And so to me, let's give the people the chance. Let's let the people speak.
What if you have the scenario where, people across greater Minnesota, here in the Twin Cities, you have the support of the voters, the constituents, but the legislators may not be expressing what their people are telling them?
Well, then I would ask the people across this state to let their legislators know what they think. These disparities, as pointed out in the research, affect kids in Roseau just as much as they affect kids in North Minneapolis, as they affect kids in West St. Paul, as they affect kids in Pipestone and Winona and Duluth or Grand Marais or wherever it may be. All of our children are being shortchanged. All of those children who are children of color and economically disadvantaged. This is an opportunity to give them a chance to achieve whatever their hopes and dreams are. And I just can't believe that we will let this opportunity pass.
So what's the strategy to build support? What do you do? I mean, these people seem pretty friendly, very interested. But how do you build statewide support?
At least they're not throwing tomatoes yet.
Not yet. But maybe you don't have any connection to children. You don't know any young people still in school. And I mean, how are you going to build support?
I have an 11-month-old baby girl, so I do know a young person who will be entering the schools. We're meeting with everybody we can meet with. If you look in our announcement last week, we had legislators of color with us. We had business leaders with us. We had tribal chiefs with us. We had community leaders with us. I mean, it was remarkable. It was like we talked to some people. They said, well, who else is with you? And we'd tell them, and they said, well, That makes me very uncomfortable that I'm going to be with that person. This is like a strange group of people who are all coming together to say, you know what, we disagree on a lot, but we agree on putting children first. And so give us a chance, give the people a chance. I think the people of Minnesota want to put children first.
Let's talk about some of the opposition to the idea of a constitutional amendment. Critics who have stepped up to say they don't think it's a good idea, who think a constitutional amendment could possibly do more harm than good. NPR News reported this. Education Minnesota, the state's largest teachers union, opposes the proposal. Quote, this removes the state's obligation to pay for a uniform system of public schools. We already have a funding crisis in our schools, and to take away the obligation from the state, who's going to pay for our schools? That was a statement from Education Minnesota President Denise Speck.
Which part of, just so I get it correctly, which part of it is the paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools, not some other public schools, not some other kind of school, but quality public schools that fulfill a child's fundamental right? Maybe I'm missing something, but all of those other things that people are worried about, at least under this proposed amendment, cannot come at the expense of quality public schools. Paramount duty, there is no higher duty. Indeed, I don't think there's another provision in Minnesota's Constitution that sets something as a paramount duty.
You know, we literally surveyed the 50 state constitutions to say what are the strongest provisions we can take from across the country and bring them to Minnesota. And then we go even further by, as you look at the language, holding the state accountable to outcomes. We believe this would take Minnesota from one of the weakest provisions to the strongest provision in the country. And so again, the paramount duty, no higher duty that the state would have.
All right, let's try another one.
Can I just?
Yes.
The current constitutional language doesn't preclude all of those concerns about vouchers and all of that. The current language doesn't preclude that from happening. It strikes me that the proposed language is stronger than the current language in that respect.
The Star Tribune reported this after the announcement of your proposal. They went to Governor Tim Walz, and he issued a statement through a spokesman. Governor Walz said he's glad to see the Fed and the business community championing educational outcomes for all Minnesota children, and he looks forward to working with them to ensure that every child has access to a world-class education, regardless of their race or their zip code. What do you take from that statement?
Well, you know, we've been reaching out to everybody across the political spectrum, and we welcome anybody and everybody to be with us. I think if Governor Walz can support this amendment, we'd welcome his support as the education governor. And you know, Justice Page and I have reached out to a lot of people who've given us suggestions on how to tweak it and whatnot, and we're open to making it stronger. If somebody has an idea on how to make this stronger for the children of Minnesota, we want to hear it. We are not open to weakening it.
The other states that have made constitutional, who've been able to get constitutional amendments, you point to Florida as an example. What should we take from that? I mean, that's Florida, very different from Minnesota.
It's not so much that we need to follow in Florida's footsteps, but it seems to me that what happened in Florida is it broke the logjam, if you will.
It got things moving.
It got things moving, and it gave people an opportunity to come together to do what was necessary. We don't prescribe remedies because, you know, people from all different backgrounds and perspectives and positions have good ideas. We don't want to preclude any of those, but we also don't want to sit here and have a fight over them either. We need to give people an incentive to come together to make it all work. And that's what I think happened in Florida.
And one thing that Justice Page talked about earlier, what kids in different parts of the state need are going to be different. And so we don't want to sit here and prescribe, hey, here's what, if this works for kids in North Minneapolis, this is what kids in Bemidji need. They probably need something different. I meet with families who say, yeah, Minnesota's got open enrollment. It's a leader in open enrollment. We just can't get our kids there. How do we get our kids to those schools? Well, maybe some families need transportation as part of their solution. So it's not the school, it's the transportation. That's why we designed this to be neutral, to just provide families and kids what they need to be successful in their city, in their town, in their situation.
All children have a fundamental right. That means to me, as I would read that every child has a fundamental right to an education that prepares them.
I want to read some of the questions now from our audience members, and thank you for submitting those. This first question is, what's your understanding of the impact of housing, nutrition, and early child care on the opportunity gaps that produce disparities in educational outcomes? How will this address any of those inequities?
Before Neel gives you his economist perspective, let me just say, those problems exist today. We have to figure out how the education system that we want will deal with, or how do I say this? How do we adapt our system so that we account for those problems to the extent that we can? We're not going to solve those problems except by educating those children. If we don't figure out how to educate the children, and maybe it's a little bit of the chicken or the egg, but if we don't figure out how to educate those children, those problems are going to persist. The solution to those problems is education for each child. That's the beginning of it, and maybe we can get at some of those. And I understand that each one of those things on that list make it very difficult for kids to learn. I mean, if you don't have a home, right, if you don't have good nutrition, if you don't have good health, we can't solve those. But we can begin to solve a problem that will get us on the road to solving those.
President Kashkari?
I agree. I mean, sometimes people talk about all of these other issues, and they're enormously important, just as Justice Page said. But if we say we have to solve all of them before we can solve any of them, it is a recipe for doing nothing. It is a prescription of paralysis. And so we got to get going. And Justice Page and I, if you have a plan to tackle housing, we'll work with you. But let's get going on education.
Another question, what is the strategy for responding to the Minnesota Teachers Association's opposition to this proposed constitutional amendment?
It is the paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools that fulfill a child's fundamental right.
We had people come to us. I didn't say it. I'm just the messenger. So what? You think there's a misunderstanding? Or?
Give their words their common and ordinary definition, and I think you can figure it out.
We had people come to us early on as we were debating language, because we want this to be as bipartisan as possible. Big Tent. And they said, we want you to take the word public out of here. so you can support religious schools and private schools and vouchers. And we said no. And that's why it says public education, paramount duty for quality public schools. This is about supporting public education. Anybody who misunderstands that has an agenda.
Next question. Could you please directly address the politics of this proposed amendment? It seems to have touched a lightning rod and immediately become politicized. Why? What's your plan to overcome that? Talked about hurdles. What's the plan?
Pull everybody into the tent we can by whatever means necessary.
I look at this amendment, it's like a window or mirror of truth. Everybody says they're for children first. Okay, if you're really for children first, put children first in the eyes of the law. And now everybody's nervous. Wait a second. What do you mean I'm going to put children first? Well, you said you're for children first. Here you go. This is your chance.
Another question. In other states, constitutional amendments intentionally open the door to legal challenges by families and students. Will legal challenges lead to the reallocation of resources necessary to address gaps?
Individual right that requires that you provide me an education that will prepare me to participate. Hard to pull money from my education in some way that precludes me from being fully prepared. Maybe a clearer way of saying that is, may there be some litigation? Certainly. How that litigation will work itself out, who knows? But I can tell you the concerns about the cost of litigation, that's one of the things that gets raised. And the concerns about, this is one I find hard to create a response to because I don't understand the issue, that wealthy families will somehow co-opt the system to advantage them. Well, anything that benefits one child through litigation will benefit all children. That's number one. Number two, this notion of litigation, if you want to, just because somebody sues you, doesn't mean that you have to defend the indefensible. And we have a system that is working now that is indefensible. And so rather than defending the indefensible, what if we sat down and worked together, which I think is quite possible to do, to put in place policies and procedures and practices that actually work, as opposed to fighting each other over something that's indefensible, less expensive, gets the result you want, which means long-term, much less expensive.
Could this take years, though? This of getting the support of the state legislators and then getting voters?
I think once you get it on the ballot and get it, if the people of this state approve the amendment, I think action will take place almost immediately, because it's going to be the catalyst for that, to bringing people together to actually do something.
And the changes may take place over it may take place over many years. Again, what is the system going to look like 20 years from now? I don't know. But I do know for decades we've made no progress. And we need to get going.
Another question, how can individuals or organizations help to champion this ballot initiative? Have materials been developed to help hold info sessions to educate voters?
Well, we need all the help we can get. And so,
And then some.
And then some. So we have a lot of staff here at the Minneapolis Fed. If you want to get involved, reach out to any of our staffers. There's Beth, there's Aline in the front, many around the room. And I understand that some people in the private sector are putting together a group to advocate for this. At the Federal Reserve, we can introduce ideas, we can talk about economics, we can talk about research and advocate for ideas. We don't run campaigns. And so there may be an opportunity, I'm told, for folks who want to get involved with an outside group that believes this is a good idea.
And talk to your legislators. That's number one, because they're the ones that have to get it on the ballot. That's the first step. Talk to your legislators.
Do I have time for one more question, or should I? One more question, last question. Your documents speak of an objective standard by which state performance will be measured. Does this mean test scores? What about social emotional learning and school climate?
Don't get me started on testing. This system that we have now, we want to keep that? Do we like that? Do we want to keep in place a system that is used to identify failure and does nothing to help the individual child progress? I mean, we don't even take the scores and identify where they are at the moment and then use that to map out where we go from here. We just simply say, here's the score, you failed, you're a problem. What we're doing now with respect to standards, and I mean, you do need standards to figure out where people are, but I can't remember the list, but the social, the emotional, all of that.
School climate?
School climate, presumably that gets put into the standards, and they can be objectively done so.
We don't propose to set the standards. The state has standards today. The people set the standards through their elected representatives. That process should continue. That process will probably evolve because they're going to be even more important going forward. Let's just hold the state accountable to whatever standards the people choose to set.
I mean, if we met the standards that we have now, we wouldn't presumably be having this conversation. But we're not meeting those standards with respect to children of color and poor children across the state. We're simply not doing it.
We have plenty more discussion to come today, but this concludes my conversation with President of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, Neel Kashkari, and Allan Page, co-founder of the Page Education Foundation and former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice. Thank you for answering our questions. Thank you for your questions as well.